The right thing. So I heard you guys talking earlier about different things that you've done for cosplay, and I'm sorry I didn't get to see who all raised their hand or did a little dance, but I assume most people probably have. I'm not sure what it's doing to me here. Oh, here I have a. So I'm sorry, was somebody telling a story about cosplay or costumes that they've done?
It was me and Dad and Zen and Crafty have all cosplayed.
Okay. Well, I'm sure you all dressed up for like some special occasion or Halloween or a special event in your family or something like that, I would imagine. Yes? Does anybody have a memory of a costume that they wore perhaps when they were younger for Halloween or for some
I
special
do.
occasion? You want to tell us your favorite Halloween costume?
My favorite Halloween costume, I carved out a pumpkin and was Jack Skellington with the pumpkin head on my actual head. It was great.
Oh, I love that. Awesome. Very cool. All right, so we're going to talk about the history of the costume and how cosplay came about. So, since we're all familiar with what costumes are, I think it's interesting because a lot of times nobody really understands, sort of how we got from where we started. And everybody sort of thinks frame of reference that it started within our own lifetime, right? So not true. It's actually a distinctive dress that has been around for a very long time. Um, Came about as part of either your individual character and sort of how you wanted to reflect that, or sometimes reflection of like a class of people. Oh, I thought I was sharing my screen. Okay. Well, I've been told I have not shared.
Share, and then you go
I did. Screens, full screen. Ah, I heard a noise. Okay. There we go. Sorry about that. I was starting to show a cool presentation. All right. Well, you guys can tell me if you can see it then. Okay. Can you guys see that screen
Yes.
slideware? All right. Cool. Anyway, what I was saying is, costumes have really been dress of an individual, or a reflection of a group or a class of people. It has been depicted for uh, showing characteristics of your gender or your profession, your ethnicity, or your nationality, where you come from. So there's lots of reasons that we have changed our clothing throughout the history, and some of the areas, we have called them costumes. But even before that, it was sort of for certain activities. So you would say a riding costume or a swimming costume or a dance costume. So a lot of times it would be specifically for an event or a celebration. So these are the types of costumes that we think about when we talk about special dress. So fashion is the one that everybody really sort of draws to in modern history because it's what you can wear, how you can identify your own personality, things that you like, colors, styles. And so that's really been the overarching theme for clothing or costuming. Cultural pride, or where you come from, where you identify as your background, ethnicity, or your country of origin. I mentioned social class. Back in the day, they used to use costumes for depicting whether you had lots of money or you were more of a commoner. And then most prominent, obviously, has become about in the modern century for performing arts and how we depict characters on stage or in theater. And that's where the more ornate and distinct costumes that you see today that are largely used on stage or in cinema or in for cosplay really kind of got its origins around the theater. Although religious ceremonies in the first few centuries was a big piece of that. We'll talk a little bit about that and I'll show some examples. And then, of course, celebrations. We talk about weddings, baptisms, religious ceremonies, graduation, where you wear cap and gown. So, various celebrations have been depicted by different types of costumes. And of course, all of us who understand sports, or if you went to high school and you had a mascot, everything has around the mascot world has kind of become a way of showing your pride in and cheering on your teams that you root for, and sort of having a kind of a brand that you follow, and using that mascot or that costume or that logo of the mascot in some sort of costume or material or face paint makeup today. And of course, we have occupational things like police officers or doctors and nurses, or various occupations, and for identification of like what type of job you have. And then, of course, play, and that's sort of where we've come today. So, costuming actually has a really long timeline. It started way back in 5 BC, long before most people realize. And it was more of just straight fabric, draping of fabric. It was gender neutral. Everybody sort of wore, fabric to cover their bodies, and there wasn't a lot of significance to to exactly how it looked until the Egyptians sort of took that and used other elements to add to the top from the shoulders up to depict whether it was female or male, or whether it was royalty or commoners. They did a lot of headdresses and headpieces. We'll talk about that. And then you moved into Rome. So there's kind of this argument of where costumes began. Was it ancient Greece with the togas, or was it Rome with the Roman Empire and the gold leaves? So there's sort of this banter back and forth as to where it happened. But I think they probably all just sort of came up with the same idea of, hey, these are boring pieces of sheets we're wearing. Let's do something to them, right? So that's kind of where those gender neutral costumes really started. And then in the 18th century, as it moved across Europe, trends moved across Europe and things became more prominent in how, like the tools that we used, and, the types of transportation we used. In Europe and England and Ireland is really where the more ornate costumes came about. So, can you guys still hear me? I hear a bunch of clicking on my machine, and I'm not sure if I've lost connection here.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. And then in the 1930s, skip ahead many years, that's really when the first costume and cosplay came about. And it was in the US at a science fiction convention. I'll talk about the origins of that. And then, of course, as we know, cosplay today came about in the 70s and 80s, really, when the first Japanese cosplay took place in 1984. So, starting with Greece, as I mentioned, there's sort of this battle between Greece and Rome. So, I'll talk a little bit about both areas. But it really, the idea of a stage costume came about in Greece with the Greek playwright when he decided that he wanted, don't ask me to pronounce his name. I think it's Cephalus. I don't know. I never pronounce it right. Um, he wanted to depict sort of the differentiation between the characters, because when they spoke or they read, you couldn't really tell who was playing which role. So he started changing up what they were wearing, and that's when different types of draping came about. As I mentioned, in Greece, they used headpieces and scarf. Of course, in Egypt, they did. The like you think of Cleopatra and her fancy hair pieces, they really used a lot more with jewelry and makeup on their faces. But this is really when Greece is really when the theatrical costume started to emerge, as more and more playwrights and going to plays and seeing plays was more popularized. As we moved into the turn of the century, costumes became much more ornate in Rome and specifically in Italy, but Rome and Venice were sort of the hubs of the costuming trends at that point. Many of the many of it changed because of the social status. So they started. It really became that masquerade balls were a thing, and everybody dressed up in these really ornate costumes, and they always had something covering their face. So you didn't know who was behind the costume. It was more about just enjoying each other, no matter who they were, whatever class they were from. You had a chance to dress up and just enjoy the parties under disguise, and that's really where it is. About the 15th century is when the masks, the Venetian masks, and the tradition of around the Venetian fancy Venetian masks really began. Then you move over to England, and this is where theater really began to emerge, was in the Shakespeare era. And this is where the costumes were moved more out of the party scene and in directly onto the stage. So everything sort of translated, unless it was for royal occasion or a very fancy um, religious type ceremony. Most of the costuming moved off the street and directly into the theater. And this is for specifically used for conveying messages, as I mentioned before, like they had done in Greece. So in England, when the fancy costumes went back to being seen more in the public eye and not just on the stage, was really you know, for special occasions and at dinner parties and mostly royal affairs. And these are the types of things that we still see today. We still see the fancy party dresses that the women wear, although they're short, they're not, long and ornate usually, but the fancy hats. And so sometimes here in the US, you equate things, other events like the Kentucky Derby and wearing the fancy hats to the Kentucky Derby. So some of those traditions sort of carried over to America, even after we, sailed the ships across the ocean. Looking at Ireland and going back, I think a lot of people are always interested to sort of figure out where Halloween came from because most of us, when we say costume, that's sort of the first thing we think about in America is, or other countries, is really sort of that Halloween experience. Um, the Ireland was really focused on the Celtic dress that they used for their traditional dance, and it was focused around the pride in the nationality and the traditions of their country. And prominently in the Renaissance era that we think of, when we go to Renaissance festivals, we see that type of costuming that really came out of Ireland and sort of the Celtic culture. Um, and they really focused on wearing the fanciest of their clothing and the trims and the headpieces and everything back when they were doing their Celtic festivals, which was called Samhain, I believe is how you say it. And it was basically their summer's end event. It happened at the end of October, but it was their New Year celebration. And so we now, have translated that into sort of the end of fall, starting of winter, and that's when we have our Halloween festival. So Halloween, has really where that came from, that Celtic culture, and the time frame of when they did their dresses. So when we think about cosplay and sort of where it came about, and what it looks like today, costumes, sort of moved from the stage into the cinema as we came, to the movie era and film industry. And now it's specific that we understand more about the character before they even speak. They can appear in a movie wearing a certain type of clothing based on color, style, and interesting characteristics. I mean, some of the costumes that have been developed over the years in the science fiction world, as soon as they walk in or the screen pops up, if you know nothing about the movie, you can kind of tell based on the background and setting, but also the costumes and what they're wearing, like what time period it is and what the topic is about and sort of, what the setting is. So costumes play a really large role in Hollywood and in our cinematic. events today. And so I, as a costumer and somebody who loves to sew, this is very interesting to me. I love seeing sort of where it's come. And as I watch the Academy Awards every year, I'm kind of like disgusted that they don't give more more interest to the costuming, because that's generally the costuming and all the colors behind it. It's sort of what makes or breaks a really great film in today's era. So, cosplay origins. Most people think that it started in Japan, and that's where it kind of all evolved from, but it actually didn't. It started in the US, and it was really came about from this gal called, her name is Myrtle Douglas. She actually had like a whole bunch of names because she'd been married several times. And so her pseudonym was Morojo. So you've probably seen that sort of listed in magazines or articles. But she was an active member of the Los Angeles Science Fiction Society, and she was a writer and editor for science fiction magazine and science fiction articles. And she really was credited as the first cosplayer. When she, in 1930, she and her friend, which they never were really boyfriend, girlfriend, they were just like minded sci fi geeks. And Forrest, he and her went to a science fiction convention. It was the first one that they'd had in Los Angeles. It was the World Science Fiction Convention, which we now know as WorldCon, and it has transitioned through the years. But she decided that she was going to move away from the masquerade type ball that they always had and the big ball gowns, and she decided to cut hers off and make it shorts, and she thought that they would do something that was much more futuristic, and the costume was called future futurista costume is how she coined it. And she designed it, and the couple wore it to that first one. Nobody else was dressed up. So they kind of, is mixed reviews as to whether they were strange and it should keep going, or if it was, something that made sense. But it took off as a tradition after that first year. Um, a year later in 1940 in Chicago, that's when the first Worldcon conference took place, and it was a masquerade. They held it as a masquerade, and literally after that first masquerade conference, it kind of just took off. And then in the 60s, is when the fans really started to spend a lot more time. They'd spend weeks and months planning out their costumes, preparing for the next year's sci-fi convention that was coming up. And that's basically, become like the modern day masquerade ball. At a lot of the comic conventions or various sci-fi conventions, they kind of have that last day where they have like a ball or a dance or something, and they'll have costume contests, and that's where that's come from. So I don't know, does anybody know the first Comic Con that actually took place and what year it was? Don't Google it, just if you happen to know. Somebody's playing a game. I can hear you typing on your keyboard. Okay. It was in 1970. It was held at the U.S. Grand Hotel in San Diego. That was the very first comic convention. And there were about 300 people in attendance. And costuming at that time really did not play a big role in the event. However, as the two events sort of merged together, they had Comic Con and then they had the science fiction convention, and they kind of combined to have the larger conventions. Costumes and cosplay, or as cosplay that we refer to now, has become like a central element of the events that take place now. So does anybody know where the word cosplay came from? Nope, nobody's speaking up. Hopefully you guys could still hear me. So the word cosplay actually is of Japanese origin, and it was the original word was, they had a word in Japanese that was kasu, which actually meant dressing up, or putting on special concept of the whole concept of dressing up. But they didn't feel like it really explained the term. The English word was masquerade, but it didn't translate well in Japanese. So they changed the term from kasu, which didn't really depict the spirit of what cosplay had become, to katku. So that's what it's called in Japan. But the words actually is short for the origin of costume display or costume play. And so that's how it came about. Cosplay is really performance art where professionals and amateurs alike participate in putting together fashion accessories and costumes, and really depicting in today's cosplay, depicting favorite comic book characters, TV series, anime shows, and even popular video games. So that's where it's come today. And there's not just conventions anymore. There's whole organizations that focus on developing costumes, sewing them, techniques in sewing, how you put them together, what each piece of armor, ornate thing might mean, and the best way to construct it. Techniques around, the like this first gal, she's carrying a hammer. Obviously, you don't want to walk around a convention with a really heavy hammer. So ways that you can construct items that they're lighter weight, but you can still depict the essence of the message that you're trying to get across. So it's become a whole real culture of things today. Oops, sorry. So that's all I had to cover about costumes and sort of the origin, how they're used today. And I meant to put a slide on here, but I actually have a booth. If you want to come by and check out my booth, I have a new Instagram. I have sewn costumes myself for many years. I've done lots of the kids' musicals and through high school and junior high for many years. And everything from wedding gowns to Halloween costumes, and something that I'm starting to do more now that we've moved and I've kind of semi-retired from some of the activities of raising a family here, starting to get back into doing more sewist type activities and sewing. So if it's something that you're interested in, or if you're wanting to commission pieces or need help figuring out techniques of how to put something together, happy to help you guys with those kinds of things. And I do have just put together an Instagram page, so I am going to start to do a little bit more of that here in the coming year ahead. Any questions or comments, thoughts as we wrap up?
On the topic of uh, like carrying around a heavy hammer, it actually amazes me, which I have seen this on some reels on like social media, where some people can make it where like objects like a sword or hammer are impossible to pull up or pick up unless they release a sort of switch or something.
I'm sorry. Repeat the last part where they're not able to pick it up or what?
No, I know what he's talking about. They use like a kind of like a magnet inside of the thing to keep it like stuck to the ground or something like that.
Interesting.
I've seen videos for stuff like that. Like they use like a common thing to use it for is like Thor's hammer, where they'll have it
Right.
like on a special spot on the floor, and
Yeah.
they'll have like a thumb scanner, and when they grab it, they can only be the one to pick it up
Oh,
because it releases
interesting.
the magnet.
Yeah, I mean it's so interesting to see how props in theater and makeup in theater and the actual costumes have really sort of emerged and crossed lines of being like the whole cosplay world, right? So you have like things like that where you can create special effects, or you're doing something different with the way that you form the face, whether it's a mask or prosthetics or just makeup. And I think it's been really fun to sort of watch how it's evolved, and how sophisticated some people have really gotten. I mean, I'm fortunate because I have an extremely creative family, So and with Dean being an engineer, we've been able to come up with some pretty creative ideas. So I look forward to, seeing where the trends go and how those sort of merge together. But it is always really interesting when you find things like that where they've just kind of brought about lots of, robotics and other kinds of things to the costumes. Cool. Well, is anybody thinking about doing cosplay this year? We're finally starting to have the conventions open up.
I have plans to personally.
Cool. You know what you're going to do yet?
No, not 100% sure.
I originally was going to do something this year, but then there was conflicting issues with seeing if I was able to go to it or I didn't have something prepared.
Yeah, it's funny because I know everybody feels like they have to spend months and months and, sometimes years sort of planning out their next costume. And I certainly know people that do, because they do these super ornate, intricate beading and sewing on and, things like that, or very sophisticated electronics that are involved. But you really can come up with some great costumes last minute just by taking, pieces of clothing from the Goodwill or secondhand stores and just deconstructing them. And so I know Tori, my kids have done that. I've deconstructed more costumes, I think, than I've probably put together in my sewing career, because if you start with a base or a form of something, it's much easier, and you don't actually have to build it from scratch. I'm somebody who likes to take parts of 3 or 4 different patterns to create what vision I'm trying to go for. I'm not oh, here's a pattern, stick to it, make it exactly like that. Which is probably why I flunked out of home economics when I was 14 because I didn't like the way the teacher told me I had to construct it. But it's worked out to be, something that's has been helpful for me, and really thinking outside the box as I moved into sort of the costuming world.
Can I make a comment on that?
Please.
You're talking about deconstructing and stuff. A lot of times when I'm making my costumes, actually most of the time, I've gone to Goodwill. I talked a little bit before you joined, Mom. I talked a little bit about how my most intricate and my favorite cosplay I've done was my Wraith cosplay, and even though I didn't have any pictures of it, I actually went to the Goodwill or went to multiple like thrift stores and looked for like the perfect leather jacket, and I cut off the arms and sewed it up so that it wasn't like loose ends, and I used that as my base to like paint and put all
Mhm.
the details of her jacket on there. Like I literally just went to the Goodwill and found the right jacket and cut it.
Well, and it's the smart financial way of doing it. I mean, costumes can really, I mean, you saw some of those. I know people that sew them and charge thousands of dollars for some of these really high intricate costumes because they take a lot of work. You could be working on the same costume for somebody for like a year, depending on how intricate it is. But some of the best ones, like Tori said, are the ones where you've been creative and you've saved the money. I know for when I'm doing costuming for high school productions or theater, community theater, they generally don't have budgets for anything and they can't just go rent a whole bunch of costumes. So we have to get creative, and you go and you find pieces that are sort of structured the way that it would be for that era or that scene, and then you know, take arms off or you add other pieces to it and you come up with that period costume. And it's nice because I mean really what's old is always new. Trends always come back around in fashion. So when they're out of style in fashion, they end up in the Goodwill or a recycle store, and that's when you can find the best ones. If you're trying to do something that's it from a previous generation, a lot of times you can find those pieces that you can kind of remake as your own. Anyway, it's a very fun world. If anybody's ever interested in using their creativity to learn more about it and kind of go into that, I'm probably when we do IRL of PixelCon here in Vegas in a few years, I'll be doing some actual sessions and hands-on things probably where you can get your hands dirty and try to create some costumes. All right, thanks everybody. Tori, turn it over to you.